Hi all, I'm really happy to be talking to you, although I wish I was in person. This is going to be a lecture about community ecology, specifically introducing species interactions, and then going into a little bit more detail about competition and what competition actually means ecologically. So read chapter 52, especially part 1, and look at your study guides to sort of keep up with the content here. And then we'll be back on Wednesday to do a case study if all goes well. I think this video might have several parts because I'm only allowed to record 15 minutes at a time for some reason. That's new. So if all goes well, after this video, you should be able to define a bunch of key terms, including competition, consumption, mutualism, and then these other terms here. We'll also talk about intra versus inter-specific competition and realized versus fundamental niches if we get to it. Then in future videos, we'll talk about how competition for resources can act as a selection pressure, leading to evolution of characters within populations. So, community ecology is a branch of ecology that deals with interactions among multiple species, not just a single species. But normally it doesn't concern itself too much with abiotic conditions. So community ecology consists of ecology about multiple interacting species that live within a defined area. And just to get your mind around it, a community generally lies between the spatial scales of a population and a biome. It's probably easier to get an idea of what a community is by thinking about some examples. So coral reef communities are a excellent example of a community. They include fish and algae and many different invertebrates, many different species of fish, all interacting with each other. Similarly, a tallgrass prairie community includes all of these different species of flowering plants, as well as soil microorganisms, soil invertebrates, pollinators, and then grazers and other animals that live among the plants as well. And I just want to give a shout out to the human microbiome as an example of a community because it's an example of multiple microbial species interacting with each other within a space, which is your own human body. So you might have up to thousands of different species of microbes interacting inside your gut, and that counts as a community too. Please note that all of the communities here, with the exception maybe of the microbiome, which does not have consumers or does not have primary producers in it, but the reef, the prairie, and the forest all have primary producers, consumers at various levels, and decomposers all interacting with one another. So one key concept of the community, of community ecology, is that interactions among species affect the distribution, that means where they live in space and across the globe, and the abundance, which is the relative number of individuals of the interacting species. So when you're looking at species interaction, one thing that you're going to pay attention to is distribution and abundance. And the second thing that you're going to pay attention to is that the interactions can serve as agents of natural selection. So they can actually be selective pressures that affect the evolution of the interacting species. So have that in mind as we're going through the rest of this chapter. And I'd like to now sort of introduce the 4 different kinds of species interactions as an introduction to more complicated community dynamics. So right now and for the rest of the week really, we're just going to be thinking about two-way species interactions and how that affects the species involved. So for each of these different kinds of species interaction, there's 4 of them. When you're talking about 2 different species interactions, we're interested in is whether there's a positive, a negative, or no effect on the species due to the interaction. So for example, commensalism, which is a kind of species interaction that we don't really study very much, at least in this class, is the idea that one species gets a benefit, so has a positive outcome on their fitness from the interaction, and the other has no effect at all. So a good example of this might be if there's a tree that is large enough to host a nest on its branches. The tree doesn't suffer anything, but it doesn't really get a benefit either. But the bird that's making a nest does have a positive interaction or a positive outcome from that interaction. So this commensalism is usually described as +0 when you're generalizing about species interactions. So here's the sort of outline for the rest of the species interactions that we're going to talk about. We're going to spend almost all our time today on competition. Consumption is sort of easy to understand, I think, because when consumption is also known as predation or herbivory, which is eating plants, or parasitism, where a smaller organism eats only a very small part of the thing that it's consuming. But either way, one of the species is the eater and the other one is the eaten. So obviously the species that's doing the eating has a positive effect on its fitness from the interaction, and obviously the eaten, the species that serves as lunch, has a negative outcome from that interaction of being eaten. So consumption is plus minus. Mutualism, which we won't spend too much time on this week, is a plus interaction. So that's an interaction like pollination, where the bumblebees get a benefit of a small food reward for pollinating, and the plant gets the benefit of finding a mate or moving its gametes from one individual to the next. So mutualism is plus, where both individuals have a positive outcome from the interaction. But what we're going to focus on is competition, which, as you can see here, is negative. What that means is that competition is defined by having a negative interaction on both species that are doing the interactions. And I'm going to go through that in a little bit more detail on the next slide. So here's a formal definition of competition among two different individuals that are either of the same species or of different species. So this is an ecological definition of competition. And what we call competition is the active demand by two or more individuals for a common limiting resources, resulting in reduced fecundity or survivorship. So let's unpack that a little bit. Fecundity or survivorship. Fecundity, those two words combined comprise the fitness of an organism. Fecundity is how many offspring are produced, and survivorship is the length of the lifetime of the organism. So competition reduces and causes reduction in fitness in both individuals as a result of demanding the same limiting resource. So resource in this context is any substance or object or location that's used by an organism and required for normal maintenance, growth, or reproduction. So this is a really vague definition of resource, and I want you to kind of open your mind to multiple kinds of resources that organisms might be competing over. It could be space, it could be food, it could be mates, it could be water, etc. So anything in the environment, a substance, an object, or even a location that is required to grow and reproduce normally. So there's 4 different characteristics that comprise a competitive interaction between two organisms, and I'll show them here. It's a little bit of a repeat from what I just said. So these 4 things are important for you to know for the next test and to understand competitive interactions. Resources must be limiting, meaning there's not enough of it in the environment to fulfill the fitness requirements of an individual to their full extent. That competition reduces fitness, and that reduction in fitness is reciprocal. So both individuals in the competitive interaction are negatively affected by the interaction. And finally, competition is density dependent, meaning that as there are more individuals in the space that are competing, the effects of the competition are felt more strongly across the different individuals. So these 4 characteristics of competition are important to remember, and we're going to come back to them later, so mark this slide somehow. So a little bit about types of competition. So we've talked about competition really broadly, and I'd like to sort of bring up two kinds of competition that you should be able to distinguish between. One is intraspecific or within species competition, like when you go to the Hoover Hall and you're fighting with co-humans, other students, for the same resource, which might be the best food that's at Hoover that day. That's intraspecific competition. Interspecific competition is if you drop your ice cream cone on the ground and try to grab it and the dog comes and eats it instead. So competition for food between two species would be interspecific competition. Those are just silly examples. You can come up with your own, and I'll show you some more examples in a moment. There's also a way to distinguish other kinds of competition. So the difference between exploitative competition and interference competition. And I'll briefly go over those, but I won't focus on it too much in this part of the class. So exploitative resource competition involves competition that makes the resource, the shared limited resources, unavailable. So food competition is the most obvious example of this, because if there are two barnacles next to each other competing for the same food, they're reducing the availability of that resources by doing the competition. So exploitative competition makes the resource unavailable for anyone else to use. Interference competition, on the other hand, is when access to the shared resource is directly restricted by the competitive interaction. So in this case, you have two barnacles that are interfering with the space that is available for sort of living on the ground, and one is crushing the other and blocking the resources, which is the resource in this case is the space to put its holdfast and to hang on for dear life. So out of these four, I'm much more concerned that you tell the difference between intra and interspecific competition, but these two can also be helpful for understanding the chapter. I want to go through a few examples of different kinds of competition, talking about what might be competed for in these pictures, just to get you in the mindset of thinking about different competitive interactions. I'm kind of going to zoom through them, and then you can go and think of your own examples as well. So these trees, you can see these roots are competing below ground for probably space and water and possibly soil nutrients. Remember, they're not competing for carbon, because the carbon, which is constructed into sugars during photosynthesis, is available in the air. These barnacles, as we mentioned earlier, are probably competing for space, and this is probably intraspecific competition for the most part, although there are some other species over here as well. So these are competing for space, and in this situation, space means access to food, and it means access to mates as well for these organisms that stay put and that are sessile. These different ferns that you can see in this picture, like this large fern and the little ones around it, are probably mostly competing for light, and you can sort of see that the leaves are kind of growing up on top of each other, trying to get most access to the sunlight that dapples through the canopy, which is above these ferns. Here we have a large bear, and bears are, first of all, bears are giant, and second of all, bears move. So what do mobile predators compete for? Well, they may be competing within a species for food, possibly for mates, possibly for territory or space, depending on the species. And across species, like shown here, predators may be competing for food. This kind of interference competition for food is actually fairly rare in nature. It gets a lot of press because it's gory and kind of gross, but it's pretty rare that species are directly competing for food, like trying to grab a meal out of one another's hand, because that is very costly to both, potentially very costly to both players. So we'll talk about that again later, but there's selection against a lot of really hard competition. Okay, finally, these individual shrubs are competing so hard that you can hardly even tell they're competing. They're sort of poisoning the soil around them in a way that's keeping them from keeping their competitors' offspring from germinating in the soil between. So sometimes competition is hard to witness because there's been so strong competition before that selection has acted against it. Okay, I'm going to stop there and move on to the next video, but you should keep going.